given on economic cycles. And this is really your opportunity to respond to what you've heard from me over the last many weeks. Based on the evidence that I presented, do you think I've made a strong case? Are you thinking about what we might do to mitigate, what I think is the inevitable, and the proposals, some of the ideas that I've put forward, and what are some of your own? And what I'd really like to start off with is just asking each of you, and many of you haven't spoken up during this whole series of lectures, but ask each of you to just come forward and offer one thing, the most important thing you've gotten out of these lectures, or the most troubling issue that you feel we have covered or failed to cover in the lectures. So put your yellow hand up and we'll recognize you. And who would like to go first? Can't have a conversation without a couple of people. Okay, Michael. I was pretty sure we could depend on you to participate, but to start us off, my friend.
Okay, in for a penny, in for a pound. No, I've greatly appreciated your survey of the question about the cycles, and obviously it's been based on American analogies, and so I've appreciated that because it's educational, and I think that's what I derive from that, really, the fact that we need to formulate a narrative in historical chronological time and see where the cycles are, and just acknowledge the fact that in fact it seems ironic or rather ridiculous, really, that we keep making the same. It's become a repetitive process, and little bits of in that chronological time, people do things. It's not that they don't do anything. They try and mitigate things and improve things, but it never seems to resolve it. And I'm still a bit, how should we put it, without being offensive to anyone, basically we do not really acknowledge the fact, or rather appreciate the fact, that we don't have to put up with it, as it were. We can, if we really see that there are problems, and then truthfully try and identify, and I don't think we really identify, we come down to a single idea that land value taxation is the silver bullet. And I don't think that is the complete answer, and we shouldn't get sidelined by the fact that that's all we need, all that needs to do. That's the big mistake. And I think there are many mistakes, and so I prefer to analyze that cycle, and because it has nuances in different times in chronological time. There are emphasis one can draw upon, but I don't think it really is land value tax per se, really, as the thing that will resolve things. I think there's more to it than that, and look towards.
Yeah, there's much going on in the world today. There's much that government does that is correct, and there's much that government does that's incorrect. And we have, theories about how the world works that are either incomplete or wrong. And I think what we can offer, those of us who embrace Henry George's perspectives, is we can offer the missing link, in a sense. And there's been a discussion on email going on by a number of people, and I've been brought into it and participated. And one of the comments that I made was that when I first became involved with the Georgist community, I recognized early on that what was missing was a think tank in the Georgist community that studied economic cycles and that would provide reports and analyses on a regular basis that would compete with the think tanks that existed elsewhere, and that would put our ideas on a par and give us credibility in a global environment, with the possibility of getting clients, including governments, to look very closely at what we were saying if our forecasts of what was coming were consistently better than, let's say, what the central banks were producing or what other think tanks were producing. And I think that is still needed. It's still something that's necessary. And the one person who's doing most of that closely with his organization is our Australian colleague, Phil Anderson. Although he's not quite doing it for the purposes that I'm suggesting, with the work he's doing, understanding cycles, not just land market cycles, but stock market cycles and bond market cycles and commodity cycles. He is attracting attention to this area of research. So I think that's my view of what we should try to do and try to put resources into it. Marty Rowland.
Yeah, thanks. And I think you had a really great idea that you expressed right there. And I think what probably needs to happen, and it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing, where we could demonstrate some kind of competence in some way, like maybe writing a policy brief of some sort, and then use that to solicit some funds to carry the research further. But usually it requires a depth of analysis, and then everybody would say, okay, yeah, it's a good idea. So maybe we need to focus on developing that depth. And today's the first day of the rest of our lives, I guess. So I think that was a great idea. One thing I didn't want to do is maybe follow up on what I think Michael had to say, is that despite Fred Harrison writing that book about the silver bullet, I understood what he was getting at. But I think to Mike's point is that we need to use the land value taxation or return and recycle, however you want to say it. I think it needs to be put in conjunction with other ideas to bring it into the 21st century. And what I've been doing and what I'm doing in a paper I'm writing is bring Henry George as describing a universal idea, and then using the ideas of Eleanor Ostrom with common pool resource management as like a regional approach, and then using Kate Rayworth as the in the weeds kind of thing, where puts numbers and charts together to say, are we getting closer? Are we getting far apart? So with all those together, you're able to get yourself out of the 19th century and take on 21st century ideas.
The challenge, of course, is getting anyone to pay attention.
Yeah.
And that's the struggle when you don't have institutional credentials. So, the kind of think tank that I wish we could put together would have to be staffed by PhD economists, people trained in econometrics and economic forecasting, with other researchers involved. So I think it's quite an undertaking. And but in absent that, the kind of project you're working on is certainly a valuable, input to the broad information that gets out into the public arena. I mean, I've been pretty fortunate as someone who's only modestly credentialed. KPMG published a paper I wrote on the importance of rent in the economy, and
That's good.
they got good circulation. And the American Journal of Economics and Sociology published a paper that I wrote a couple years ago, trying to make the connections that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Not just focused on, public collection of rent by itself, but monetary theory and a lot of what I've talked about in this series of lectures. So the work that you're doing, others hopefully will engage in similar kind of research and writing. And one never knows what the possible, public response will be.
Yeah, I'm putting this book up. Hopefully you can read it.
It's blurry.
Okay, well, let me read what it says.
Okay.
It's Theory and History of Banking, Charles Dunbar, 1891. So this was written while George was still alive. And he describes the banking system that seems to be elusive to a lot of people, but he doesn't come out and say out of thin air, but you get to understand how when a community starts, having a bank is kind of like an economic engine. And so you don't get an engine by throwing $100 into a pot and then you depend on the interest from there. You get wealth by multiplying that through the creation of loans. So you have to read through the lines to understand the creation of money through loans, but it's pretty well established. This book established it pretty well for me. So,
well, I'd have to read it myself, but it just brings up my point of contention that banks should be intermediaries in their responsibility in their activities, and they should raise the financial reserves with which to make loans. I still think that is a reform that has to be evaluated, because I think the existing system, as you described it, as has been consistently described, that when a bank makes a loan, it's creating new money, that in fact sets the stage for instability and sets the stage for, in many cases, potential banking crises.
well, I guess I have to disagree and just say that
Which is fine.
the first national bank of the United States was formed with that in mind, to fund improvements like the Erie Canal and other things, because of what you're doing, just creating the infrastructure that everybody else can tap into. They don't.
Well, remember, I'm distinguishing between a government entity, a government institution, whether it's a government bank or not, and a commercial bank. I agree with Henry George that government should be the issuer of money in a society, and you can do that through a government-owned bank that's authorized to issue government legal tender. But commercial banks themselves, my view is that they should be required to raise the cash with which they use to make loans. And they do that by issuing stock. They do that by taking in deposits. They do that by going into the credit markets. But I think that that's something that we need as a society, in terms of our government, needs to look at the history of bank created money as a source of instability.
Yeah, and just last thing before
Marty, would you mind sharing the title of that book in the chat?
Yeah, it was. You want me to put it on the screen or
Put it on the chat. It's easier.
put it in the chat? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, last thing I want to mention is that I think that once you understand how banks work and how banks can be an engine for growth and development of a society, it's illogical that we allow commercial banks to exist, because public banks can do everything that we need and we have more control over them. So I guess that's the conundrum, is all the money that goes into that kind of sector. They're going to convince us that we have to use them.
This is food for a lot further discussion.
Yeah.
May I just interject there? Marty, you are making an assumption which definitely would make sense in a country where public banks are also very well regulated. You have a democratic system where people have an oversight. You have countries where you have public banks that abuse the ability to make money.
Yeah.
Give you an example of Uganda under Idi Amin Dada.
Yeah, we know the experience.
So, but I think Ed's point, I think the key here is discriminating between money creation and lending. So the money creation is a privilege that should belong to the community.
Yeah.
Public banks can probably do that better than private banks, the government. But then banking as a business should be allowed, as long as banks lend the money that people are depositing, or they raise capital by issuing bonds and so on, just like Ed put it. I think the problem is there. That's the point of contention between money creation and lending,
Yeah.
That's
Well, we know the experience after 1837. So, when had all those wildcat banks. So, well, that's all I have. Thanks.
Yeah. But those are important issues that have to be further explored. And, the opportunity to present papers on this subject and get, the banking community potentially interested in discussion. That's, I think, an important challenge for those of us who see reform as necessary. How do we find a listening audience? People who are willing to entertain these. There are plenty of reform groups, and I'm sure Joe's going to enter into this discussion and give us his perspective on where it all fits together. So, Joe, you're up next.
You are muted, Joe. Okay.
I have a question for you before I make my own statement here. What are ultimately, you have been telling us what you think is the most likely thing to happen.
Correct.
And what are the odds that you think that will happen?
Right now, I think it's about 90-10.
90-10. Okay. So
yeah, I think it's highly likely that it will happen.
Okay. So my reaction to you is you're probably wrong. At the very least, people have, three scenarios, the business cases of what's going to happen. And so at the moment, I'll say, best case, worst case, most probable case, whatever. There's probably at least three scenarios that you could put together, general scenarios. And I would say, and maybe 10. So I think the odds are probably, at the moment, probably 30%, 33% of this kind of thing happening. But you've made us aware of a tremendously important list of variables that are really critical for us to understand. And I really appreciate that. In the last 2 years, so many conspiracy theories have arisen. And don't mean to offend anybody in the group. They may have some views that some people might qualify as that. But what it's done for us, I think, the last 2 years is sharpen our skills of logic. People will talk about confirmation bias and various fallacies, logical fallacies, the gambler's fallacies, and all the rest of it. And it's made us, I think, better thinkers as we're dealing with people who hold certain positions about vaccines or what have you. So from that perspective, I would say I think it's unlikely that you're right. There's just so many variables right now. Whereas right now we know what the Fed's doing, and we can see what's happening, and the IMF and so forth is changing their forecasts even as they speak because of the variables that they can see active, right? And then there's, you know, what I can't remember who it was who said we don't know what we don't know.
Well,
And that been years out,
yeah.
we're kind of in that situation. So as an example, one scenario is that that climate change is accelerating, appears to be, and that a lot more money is going to be spent on repairs, maintenance, new materials, replacements, upgrades, infrastructure, et cetera. And what we could end up with is very tight economies for the next few years as they start investing heavily in energy and all these things, renewable energies. And I think that's a very, you know, likely probability. It's maybe, again, it's 30% or something. Maybe it's 50. Maybe that's the most likely scenario. I don't know.
Well, I offer just two counters to think about. Two of those variables that are endogenous to our history, and that is when the level of income and wealth concentration was this high, and when the level of property prices was this high, we had severe economic downturns that were recessions that became depressions because of governments, again, acting in their perceived individual self-interest and basically shutting down the global economy's ability to respond. So I think, Joe, what you're hoping is that government will be wiser this time than it's ever been.
It's true. That's true.
But
I
my plan is to continue to monitor, you know, the segments of the economy. I mean, I'm basically going to do what Phil Anderson does with his firm. I'm going to do that at least annually to see, you know, whether or not we're getting worse in terms of those variables.
The thing is, we have two precedents, 2008 and 2020, where a reaction, financial, monetary reaction, was quite different from the kinds of events you talked about. They were forced to do things monetarily that they hadn't done in a long time, maybe since World War II. And I think the reaction to the COVID crisis was much more rapid because of what they learned in 2008. And I'm reading in some of the, even the Fed papers, it's clear that the thinking is a little, there's been a penny has dropped. And here in Canada, almost all the extra money that was spent, 10 times the normal deficit in hard times, 10 times, was all held by the Bank of Canada. In UK, I think, was very similar. I don't know how high it was in the US, but I know it was higher, much higher than usual. And I know that their balance sheet has gone from a trillion to 9 trillion in the last 15 years.
Well, take the UK, what's going on in the UK right now with, the government policies working to tame inflation and the central bank policies working in another direction.
Right.
So in the United States, a lot about our short-term economic policy is going to depend on what happens with this upcoming midterm election here. And then subsequently, what happens when we have the presidential election 2 years further on. So I don't know if politics is an externality or it's, part of the, embedded dynamics that work the cycle. All I can say is that, as I've conveyed to you over the chronological history, it hasn't mattered much whether there is a conservative or a progressive government in place. The cycle continues to repeat and repeat and repeat.
Well, you've just kind of given my belief ammunition, because you listed both known unknowns, what we know we don't know, those political results, and then there's the what we don't know we don't know. and you know, there's just too many variables, I think. So I would bet against you. I think it's a reasonable scenario that you're listing. As I say, maybe 30%, maybe less. And but I would bet against you because, you know, in gambling and forecasting, you have to go with the odds. And I think,
well, I think most of the 26 people on with us today would hope you're right and I'm wrong. So
yeah, well, hope's not going to cut it. Anyway, thank you. You've really it's been thought provoking and really made us think outside the box about all the possible influences.
it's been a real joy and a lot of fun, with a lot of really good, hard-hitting questions and observations that have come from those of you who stepped forward. And so, you know, there's still quite a few folks here who we haven't heard from. Who would like to enter into this discussion? Charlie.
How are
Welcome.
you, Ed?
Welcome.
Yeah, I just thought I'd say something since no one else wants to put their hand up. But yeah, I do. Everyone here should have a say, and I encourage everyone. Like, I'm not the most knowledgeable person here, or, you know, I'm learning a lot from all you guys. So yeah, I encourage anyone listening to put their hand up and just have a say, regardless of whether you think it's important or not. Just have a go. But yeah, like there's a lot that has been said, and I have to agree with Ed, to be honest. And I'm a big follower of Phil, and it just seems that every time you know, doom and gloom happens, the government's going to intervene and do something to help kick the can along the road until they can't do it no more. And I think what I'm worried about more is you know, I look at, you know, the whole picture and what the WF want to implement, and the whole thing about central bank digital currencies, and I think that's the scary thing about what's coming and what's going to be different this time around in this crash. Because I think, you know, after we do have this big crash that I believe is coming as well, they're already implementing framework to roll out these CBDCs, which you know, is still a fiat digital currency that can be programmed and puts people under more control, which I'm highly against. So I think that's the scary thing that's coming, that's going to be different to the last sort of crashes. And I think that needs to be discussed a bit more amongst people, because a lot of people aren't aware of what these people want to do. Yeah, that's the scary thing for me that haven't really been touched on much.
Well, the whole issue of moving to a, you know, kind of digital international currency, independent of the central banks, for example, and their control. We've watched over and over again how, you know, the move to cryptocurrency has been accompanied by huge speculative, you know, jumps and crashes. And I don't pretend to have a good handle on how that can be controlled. I mean, here we have currency produced out of thin air that people have been willing to speculate in and then use to engage in commerce. Now, what is going to change, as you suggested, if the nation's central banks begin to issue their own cryptocurrency, and that takes over a large portion of commerce from traditional currency? I don't think that can have a stabilizing effect on markets, and therefore I think unless they get it somehow right, that it will do nothing to prevent 2026 from coming about. That's,
It definitely won't prevent it, and it's going to be a way that they roll it out and push it onto people. Because, for what I understand, the first part, how they want to get people on is it's happening in America and Australia as well, and they want to roll out the framework by 2023, so it's coming pretty soon. And they're going to tell the people that rely on government payments, if you want to get paid by the government, you have to come on this new payment system, which is the CBDC, which is a central bank issued digital currency. So that's going to be the beginning, and it's going to be a slower rollout, you know, and it's going to come, you know, underneath people's eyes, and they're not even going to notice it's happening. But that's the first target, you know, people that rely on government payment to have to say, well, if you want to get paid, this is what you have to come on. So that's the first step that, you know, that I've been researching and is going to happen. And I think the crash, when that does come, it's going to make a lot of people a lot poorer. And that's going to be an initiative to get people onto this new system. And the WF are pretty vocal about their, you know, their intentions. And obviously there's a lot of powerful people. I know if people here are aware of who's involved in that, but it's very public information. You can see what their intentions are, and that is a very scary thing and a very possible scenario that could happen.
well, it'll be something that I'll be, you know, taking a look at as the months go by and as each year goes by, to see, in fact, you know, what the market response has been and how it's affected things like household savings, and whether governments are expanding the money supply without really knowing what its impact is going to be on the distribution of income, on inflation. I mean, when you're introducing a whole new you know, aspect to commerce, it's like, you know, think about the gamble that Jeff Bezos played when he started Amazon. He had to get investors who were willing to wait quite a few years for his company to actually turn a profit. And in the meantime, even though his company wasn't profitable, the stock values were going up. Why was that? Because people were speculating that eventually his company would be profitable. So there's going to be a lot of that surrounding this whole idea, you know, of multi-issuers of digital currency, at least in my view.
Yeah, well, look, like I said, the stuff I've seen scary, because in the sense that it's just not going to be fiat money. It's going to be money that can be programmable, and you know, it's going to be a lot more as a control mechanism for government over people that really have no choice. You know, like, you know, it's very, very, very scary thought if that's the way we're heading.
Well,
and I don't know if there's anyone out there
here's something in the United States that's been, I don't know how true it is, because I haven't seen details, but apparently there are Republicans in the United States now in Congress who have a plan to phase out Social Security benefits. Now, 1 out of 4 senior citizens in the United States is totally dependent on Social Security benefit payments for their life, for their income. They have no other income, they have no savings, they have no investment. So what's going to happen to those people if the Republicans get their way? If they decide to eliminate, you know, the very basic income that comes to these people?
Well, that's 25% of people already they've got on board to have, you know, be paid in this CBDC. Like, that's how easy it is to get a large percentage of people onto this new system, and all they need, I think, is a majority to be able to roll it out. So that's a big thing I'm worried about that's coming. And like I said,
I think Joe has a response to what you've had to say, Charlie.
No dramas.
So Charlie, you know, you're referring to something that's been said numerous times, that the CBDCs are a tool of the devil, and you know, that's a scenario, but it's denying the fact that there are all sorts of constitutional protections. Let's talk the United States for now. It's true in Canada. All sorts of privacy connections, all sorts of laws that protect us. The kind of thing you're talking about, the government could do now. They could work with the banks, the banksters, and all that information could be revealed, and they could be controlling you and getting all sorts of evidence about you, which again is unlawful. And I think that kind of talk needs proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Everything that we now know exists in our society would say that that's not possible in democratic rule of law countries. I'm not talking about China here. And this kind of talk is scary. And who benefits from this kind of talk? The banking system, the one that Ed just mentioned, needs to be reined in. They want to say, don't do that because it's really bad for you. I mean, there's all sorts of hidden agendas. We're told things by the corporate groups about free trade, and that's been, the way they practically wrote the free trade laws, and they wrote them in a way which was very hard on American workers, and all the offshoring and so forth. And they were just, the corporate agenda was to get government and labor off its back. It's like
I think
lawyer.
the number is that there are 4 bank lobbyists in Washington for every congressman.
Yeah, and so Charlie, I'd like to hear your thinking on why we wouldn't continue to be protected by the legal systems and rule of law protections. I mean, obviously there are countries which go from a good democracy to something that's more of a dictatorship or autocracy, in which all sorts of personal freedoms are ripped away. And but just no justification. This is a scary. If you look at your banking now, the banks have to report if you've got over $10,000 transactions, and there are rules about knowing your client and so forth. And because some of that anonymity has been used to launder money and to deal in human trafficking and drug trafficking and gun trafficking and everything else. I mean, being part of society means that our rights aren't absolute, but we're a lot freer than we would be in a law of the jungle, ancient, situation. So
let Charlie
have at it,
respond,
Charlie.
Joe, and then Victor has his hand up to join the discussion.
Yeah, look, Joe, I think it's important to look at both scenarios and both extreme sides of the good and bad and everything in between, and obviously prepare for both if you can. And again, I live in Melbourne. We probably went through some of the worst lockdown, controlling totalitarian rules that in the world through COVID. So I never thought that I would wake up one day and I couldn't leave my house or go to the shops when I wanted, or, my freedoms got taken away overnight in a country that's supposed to be, the land of the free and opportunity. So, that starts to make you think a lot. And even you guys in Canada, when the truckies were protesting and anyone donating got their bank accounts frozen, that level of control is happening and has happened. So
No,
there's
hold
nothing
it, Charlie.
Yeah.
That's not true. Here's what happened. Canada has rules about, and the United States, I'm sure, does as well, has rules about who can donate to political activity. And certainly money coming from outside the country to influence political activity is unlawful. And that's basically what was happening. You had a few people, wackos, and believe me, I've looked very hard at the leaders of that trucker thing. Most of them are criminals or anarchists. These were not good people. These were people who didn't even know. They didn't even know how our political system works. They were demanding things politically that were impossible. This was a terrible thing, and they cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in trade. They closed up trade routes. I mean, this was anarchy. Okay. And
Yep.
and they were, one of the things you do is you stop immediately foreign money coming in and funding this kind of behavior. I mean, this money could have been coming from Russia, could have been coming from China. You stop that. That is just, it was against the law. Okay. That's the truth. And the story you're hearing
Yeah.
is, you know, that this was totalitarianism. I live here. I know people who lived in Ottawa who were victims of these people, and it was horrible. It was just horrible. It was,
Yeah,
it was,
look,
it wasn't a legal protest. Okay. It wasn't a legal
Yeah.
protest by any means.
and
I
that's
have,
good.
I have
Yeah,
one
sorry.
comment that I want you
Yeah.
to think about. Everything that you've been discussing on this issue weighs in the balance between stability and instability. And everything that you've been talking about has created an environment of greater instability. And with greater instability, there's more opportunity for shocks to the system, and there's more opportunity for inappropriate action on the part of many players in the private sector as well as government. And so those are just a couple reasons more why I do not think that there's any intervention that will occur between now and 2026 that will prevent the cycle from realizing its inevitable, arrival and consequence. That's
I agree.
just to me.
Even
Victor.
Phil's been a big thing with sorry, can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
But yeah, because even with that, like I agree with you, Ed, like, you know, the UK has discussed doing 50-year loans now. There's always going to be government money coming in to help support, you know, purchases of new homes for younger generation of people that can't afford to get in. You know, even throughout history, there always seems to be something, whether it's new or that's happened before, that comes into play to keep the cycle going. So I can't see why it's going to be any different this time. And again, more to Joe's argument, and there are bad people that do bad things, and you can't stop that. But why should everyone have to suffer, the consequence for a couple of wrongdoings? And I believe in a free market as well. Like, I should be able to send my money to whoever I want. And if it is criminal what I'm doing, then I should suffer the consequence. But I should be able to do that if that's what I choose to do, which is my point of just freedom to transact and do what you want to do with your own money and your own voice, which is,
well, Charlie, there is this
so.
consideration that there's a difference between the definition of freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
And so the philosopher Mortimer Adler wrote that liberty is freedom constrained by justice. And so we have, issues of what is required to achieve justice, what is required to protect the larger community. And so do your individual freedoms have to be constrained in order to achieve liberty for the large majority? And this pandemic has certainly challenged, all of that with the requirements that we've had to, socialize, distance, keep our distance from one another, wear masks, and the requirement to get a vaccination. There's always this issue of I'm willing to take a risk as an individual, but is the risk I'm taking as an individual going to jeopardize the liberty of others? And so therefore my freedom should be constrained because of the larger interest of liberty for everyone. And I mean, I'm not saying it's an easy issue to resolve, but
there's arguments both sides. I agree.
Yeah,
I just don't think there's a few people that knows what's best for everyone either. So I think that there needs to be a lot more discussion and sort of arguments for both sides rather than just a few people making decisions for everyone, but thinking they know best. But yeah, I'll shut up now that someone else.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, that's the question of whether or not we have a democracy, or as Victor is going to suggest that we have some other sort of governmental mechanism at work. Hello, Victor.
Hello. If you believe that we are a republic or a democracy, as Joe suggested, or Charlie might believe, you are deluded. Deluded. the United States is an oligarchy. It has been since about 1947 with the National Security Act. This, and I'd like you to come up with a solution based on, if you were emperor, what would you like to see happen in like 3 months? What do you see as a solution? Because I see a simple solution. The simple solution is get rid of corporations. They had no right to begin and they have no right to continue. We're under a British system. The idea of pledging allegiance to an individual, whether it's a corporate commissar or a corporate king or a foreign queen, that should have gone out with the American Revolution. And
well, Victor, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Okay, I'm sympathetic to the concerns about corporate power, and that the corporate power certainly needs to be reined in. But the typical response would be, well, how would entities raise the financial capital to engage in large scale production without the corporate form of ownership and the ability to raise that financial capital by issuing shares of stock?
You're putting the cart before the horse. As in Rights of Man, as Thomas Paine pointed out, the granting of charters does not give power, it takes power away. Like when the king started giving charters to different colonies, he was taking power from the people that already lived there. That's like a macro example. So to the extent that you even grant a private charter, you do it on the basis of service to the country. If they are not serving the country, you revoke their charter. If they had no right to begin, they have no right to continue. There's also no states' rights. States have no rights, only people have rights, much less corporations. So if we just get back to basics and forget about all these loyalty to the royalty, I think we're halfway home. How you raise money, the money belongs to the nation, and they'll allocate it according to their needs through a form of democracy, which we haven't had since about 1922, 1929. But that's a topic for longer discussion. But I want to hear your solution. If you were king in 90 days, what would you propose as a way to resolve the issue? I don't think property taxes is anywhere near the solution.
Well, I offered at the end of this series of lectures a complete program of reform. And so that's what I would put forward on the table to be adopted and implemented. And it consists of, the fundamental issue of moving to the public collection of rents from all sources, all those sources that I listed. That would be one. And changing the structure of our individual income tax system, dealing with promoting cooperatives over the corporate form of ownership. Would I advocate eliminating, corporations overnight in 90 days? Well, we'd have to have a plan of transition, because many of us, not a majority, but many of us hold shares of stock. And that's part of our individual portfolio of assets. And we look at that as part of our net worth. So how would that, destroying the value of corporate shares would have a harmful effect on a large number of individuals and households. So I think it's more complex, although it might sound good to say corporations are all bad, and so we should eliminate the privileges that they've enjoyed and require them to dissolve, sell off their assets, and form sole proprietorships or partnerships or cooperatives. I think, even if in a political cell, there would have to be a transitional period involved. But I think, my own view is, and I've offered what I think is a program of reform and I'd embrace those reforms in whole. Public banking, movement, elimination of the Federal Reserve's ability to issue Federal Reserve notes, transfer the money issuance directly to the government, to the U.S. Treasury, all the other measures of allowing government agencies to be budgeted and spend new money creation into the economy for infrastructure improvement. We still have to take care of, income and wealth inequality. So we're going to need a, program of income distribution change. So I don't know. I mean, there's no silver bullet, Victor. I think there's a wide variety of things that have to be done, and reining in corporate power is certainly on the agenda in my view.
I don't think that's enough. If you're going to get rid of corporate power, why not go back to a 90-cent progressive tax rate like they had under Eisenhower?
Well, I wrote, that's what I wrote basically, that my proposal for individual income tax reform: exempt everybody up to the national median, no other exemptions or deductions, and then have a progressive rate of taxation applied to higher ranges of income. And so then the maximum rate of taxation on incomes over some number, I don't know what it would be, $100 million, $50 million, whatever, 90%. I don't, I think that implemented would change a lot. It would change a lot to have, and involved in that is ending the preferential treatment for so-called capital gains on the sale of any kind of asset. Whatever your gain is, that's part of your income. It goes into your income that you report, and then your income is subject to this progressive rate of taxation. So we get back to maybe a 90% marginal tax rate on the highest incomes, which are going to be primarily unearned, rent derived.
My fundamental disagreement with your proposal is that you don't seem to recognize that we're an oligarchy. You're going after symptoms, property taxes, capital gains taxes. These are symptoms of an oligarchy. Who gave them the right to print money on Wall Street? That's essentially what they're doing with these PE ratios. I have an MBA degree in addition to a sociology degree, graduate degrees. So I've looked into this. When you give them a right to come up with blue sky laws, which allow you to sell the Brooklyn Bridge to somebody as long as you tell them that you don't own it and you won't gain anything, that's just nuts. And that's the power of oligarchy. They can go out and lie and essentially print money. And unless you go after removing the oligarchy, corporate royalty, and foreign royalty, I don't see a solution.
Well, I said this earlier. I personally am an incrementalist. I think that we have, and I'm probably sympathetic with Joe in this, we have the rule of law, we have institutional protections, we have a lot of imperfection, and in our political system in the United States, I think we need term limits. I think we need publicly funded elections. I think we need proportional representation. That's just a start. Elimination of the electoral college. I mean, there's a long list of reforms that are being worked on as we speak. So building public support for these reforms is an ongoing challenge, and getting people elected to the state legislatures, or even starting out with your own city council, with people who are reform minded and aren't beholden to the existing power structure. That has been an extreme challenge already, and publicly funded elections and term limits could help. Andrew.
Yeah, g'day, Ed. Look, thanks very much for all the lectures. I really enjoyed them, and I've learnt a hell of a lot. I just suppose my question is, I've been following Phil Anderson since 2010. it's been a real eye opener. You can literally watch the cycle pass in front of your eyes. You're reading the news, you're seeing things happens, and you just go, "Oh, that's cycle related." But of course, when you speak to your friends, they look at you as if you're an alien and you've got no idea. So,
Friends, how about your relatives and family?
yeah, exactly. So I've got a pretty basic question but is there any way to introduce them to the concept where they're not so just like, that's just rubbish? Have you got any suggestions there of how to maybe start the conversation at the very least?
Well, that's what this series of lectures was about. I mean, the statistics and data I presented apply to the United States. So, maybe you can convince someone in Phil's team to take the presentation that I put together and change all of the charts so that they're Australian and
Right.
and make the same sort of, I've borrowed from other people consistently when I think they have good ideas. So, for yourself in Australia, this is the only way that this is a teaching, learning opportunity for both me and those of you who are joining me. I'm learning too as I listen to you. I have become much more appreciative of modern monetary theory because I've listened to others talk about it, and I've listened to the arguments about public banking, what Ellen Brown has presented in different speaking engagements, and I've listened to the Marxist economist Richard Wolff talk about cooperatives, and all of these very smart people have come up with extraordinarily important insights and offered ideas for changing the system. Politically, what Victor's talking about politically, extremely important. How do you get public, reach a critical mass for such changes to occur? I don't pretend to have that answer at all. It sometimes seems to happen without any specific identifiable cause, but in all education and this kind of back and forth discussion is important. The problem is that a lot of people don't want to engage in this kind of discussion. They don't want to put the time in trying to gain a better understanding, and you can almost understand the reason why. People are dealing with their daily lives, putting food on the table, taking care of their children, trying to deal with all of the things that are going on in their lives. And so many people just say, my family, I have 3 sisters and a brother, and my brother and I will have these discussions, but he has other interests. He's retired and he wants to play golf twice a week. My sisters couldn't care less about the economy or politics. They're concerned about their family lives, their children, their grandchildren. And so what's the there's a truism that 80% of the work is always done by 20% of the people. And so that's maybe where we are, And so all I can do is hope that I've obviously given you some things to think about. What you do with that insight, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ed. Much appreciated.
Next, anyone else? There's plenty of others who've been sitting back. I'm sure you have something you want to talk about. Or Charlie wants to come back on.
I just wanted to touch on what Andrew was saying, because I found the same issues. I'm trying to bring up this and educate people, but it just comes back to when I was in my own bubble and I ran my own business and it was stressful. I heard what was going on in the media. All people I was around used to talk about the same thing. So I just wasn't subjected to any of this information. It was never in front of me. And it was only until I sort of I lost my business through COVID. I found it too hard, and I stopped that, and I had the time to actually dig and found this sort of stuff. So I think it's just a case of you know, people don't want to speak out against what the masses are saying and thinking. They don't want to seem like the alien in the room. So I think that's the biggest hurdle, trying to get past, you know, putting your voice out there. That's very different to what everyone's hearing. So I think that's the challenge.
Well, there are
That's
many, you know, public advocacy groups in every country. You know, there are, you know, decisions to made about whether or not you want to become politically active and what party you think best serves your interest. You know, I'm a member of the Green Party in the United States. The Green Party in the United States has absolutely no ability to elect people to office, or very few people to office around the country. Why is that? Because people in the United States are either committed to be Republicans or Democrats without much thought given to that decision, or they're independents and they're basically uninvolved until the elections come up, and then they may make a decision to come to the election booth and vote for candidates. So each of us has to, based on our life conditions, has to decide what, if anything, we're able to do. I will say this, I admit, I've been very fortunate. I was paid to do market analysis. I went to work every day and I was immersed in economic statistics, mostly related to the housing sector, but always, you know, in the larger arena. So for me, it was a very natural thing, even though I wasn't an economist, it was a very natural thing for me to look at how these markets affected one another and how public policy affected the markets, and then how it all together eventually affected our economic well-being. And I thank being introduced to Henry George's writings, you know, for that final light that went off, that, you know, brought it all together for me. Jim Frederickson, how are you?
Fine, thank you, sir. This remark is in response to the question raised by Andrew a couple of speakers ago. He wanted to know how to bring up this idea to people who've never heard of it. And one possibility is to consult Milton Friedman's August 10, 1981 Newsweek article entitled "Good Wealth, Bad Wealth," in which he makes up an example of Mr. Smith, who invests $60,000 to build a widget factory, and Mr. Jones, who spent $60,000 to buy a taxi cab medallion, and points out the difference between the fact that Smith's investment adds to the productive capacity of the community while Jones's does not. If you can get somebody to understand that, then it's not that big a step to get them to understand that if Jones were to invest in a site, that investment would be analogous to investing in a taxi cab medallion. It would not add to the productive capacity of the community one iota. So that's one way to start. And a lot of, I think you can get that article by Milton Friedman on the internet.
And there's also a video clip of Milton Friedman at a conference I guess, I'm not sure who was all there. It was either libertarians or it was economists. And he basically says something to the effect, you're all going to be very surprised by what I'm going to say now. But, you know, the best way for government to raise revenue is the proposal that Henry George made so long ago, and that is imposing a tax on the value of land. So, you know, Friedman offers a lot, you know, for those who are on the free market side of the equation, the intellectual equation. You know, Friedman offers a lot of evidence that support, you know, the need to publicly capture rent. Problem I ever always had with Milton Friedman, he never seemed to make that connection to the macro economy and to economic cycles. He sort of thought this is a desirable public policy, but he never really, I can't find that he ever said this is integral to a stable economic climate.
Right. One reason for that might be, Ed, the fact that, and I'm not, this is fourth hand information now, but a friend of mine who's no longer with us, Sam Venarella,
Oh yeah, Sam.
many years ago, thought about taking a class at University of Chicago with Milton Friedman. This is back before 1970. And he asked Milton Friedman why he doesn't bring up Henry Georgian economics or Henry George's approach more often. And Friedman said, if I did, I would lose my audience.
Yeah.
People come to me because they know I'm an advocate of free market economy. If I were to start advocating site value taxation, I would lose a good deal of my readership.
Well,
And so that was Sam's understanding of Milton Friedman's reluctance to be a strong advocate for site taxation.
I did my graduate work for my master's degree after I had studied Henry George. And so I had one economics class, a macroeconomics class, and I got into one week a long argument or discussion with my professor on land markets. And we went on for over a half an hour in class, to the amazement of my fellow students. And my professor finally said, well, Mr. Dodson, since I can't seem to really adequately respond to your insights or your comments, we're going to have to end this discussion and move on. I got an A- in that course. And I always thought why I got the minus was because I challenged him so often in the classroom. Joe, Joe, what do you got to say?
I don't remember. No, seriously. No, I really like James' comments about Milton Friedman. Talking about stability, that was the title of his 1948 paper, in which he, really supports Henry George there as well. It's the greenback position. In that 1948 paper, he said he essentially endorses the Chicago plan, that there should be full reserves, and the money, the government, if it had shortfalls, should be issue bonds, which would be purchased by the central bank, and they'd have the money. In I think 1965, he wrote a book, and I can't remember exactly what it was called, but he reissued it in 1992. And in the preface, updated preface, he refers to that position and says he still held it. He mentioned that it's been changed a little, often called narrow banking, but so he held that position too. And
well, Joe, might you take the time, since you sort of gathered some of this information, to write up an article on this, giving us some details on the evolution of Milton Friedman's thinking and writing on the subject of whether or not we should tax land values.
Yeah, I don't know that much about it, but you and I can chat about that later. But you definitely made the point of something he definitely said, and Friedman, he tried too hard, I think, to make the market, to insert the market efficiency into government, and that's where he gets his bad rap, I think. But he had a lot of really good thoughts, and those two, I think, are his most important ones because they're both Georgist.
Well, Milton Friedman obviously had a long career, was extremely influential with those who believe in market systems, and some of his advice, when followed, worked. Some of his advice, when followed, did not work. So the jury is probably out for now until further economic historians look more closely at Friedman's contributions to economic theory. Michael, you're back to talk.
I just want to raise one point, actually, which I find quite interesting. You know, in England, I live in England, obviously. The enclosure unit was a very strong event in history, and I would just like to point out that the enclosure unit, the enclosure
Movement.
movement,
We call it a movement, yeah.
yeah, it is still with us. In fact, physically in the same form, is alive and well in this country anyway. The monarchy in this country are still dominant enclosure people. The Duchy of Cornwall is one of the biggest estates in England, and it was delegated by King Charles to his son, and it's a revenue stream that goes back to the Middle Ages, basically, and is alive and well. But that's one area that might cause a few rankles. But we have new enclosures. There's another book called New Enclosures. So we're making in our society, we're making new enclosures and expanding all the time. I mean, even I've just written down here, even climate change activists are controlling or affecting opinions. So that's a sort of enclosure movement in that sense. You know, the opinions have become a lobby, and they dominate things in a very succinct way. So, you know, the enclosure concept, it just changes and takes on different characteristics in different ages. But it goes back to land when you go to the original enclosure units, because of the great reward on land, you know, because of the economic rent that accrues, and that's still retained in a we're supposed to live in this country a constitutional monarchy or whatever it is, and it's alive and well and very, very dangerous. We haven't really got rid of it. Charles III has got an unfortunate name, in fact, because the first Charles I got his head chopped off because of his antics, and the next child wasn't much better. And let's hope Charles III is perhaps going to relinquish all his hereditary enclosures. Who knows?
Well, there's always risk when you replace one system with another, because after Charles I, you got Oliver Cromwell, and the people decided we don't want another Cromwell, so we'll take a king back.
I know.
So, you know, part of it is people get comfortable with the devil we know as opposed to the devil we don't know.
Yeah.
But we have enclosures going on here, certainly. I mean, we have maybe 100 people own enough land in the United States the size of several states.
Exactly.
You know, so and more land is being consolidated through purchases by corporations and other very wealthy individuals.
Yeah.
So I think the statistic here in the United States is that all owners of residential property own less than 2% of the land area in the country. Now, that percentage of land value is probably considerably higher. I don't know exactly what it is. I have to work that out. But you know, most people who own a residential property own a pretty tiny piece of the country, you know, or at least have a deed to a tiny piece of the country. What is the rate of home ownership in the UK?
I'm not sure. It's similar. There's a very, very high proportion of land is owned by a great number. But you know, even us freeholders, I own the freehold of my house, and I benefit from increased house values and land. When I bought my house 25 years ago, it cost me, I think, 390,000. It's now worth 1.5 million.
Well,
et cetera, et cetera, you know. So,
you know, as Fred Harrison has been saying, the real enemy of reform is not so much the, the real large landowners, it's the middle class
Exactly.
owners of residential property,
Yeah,
because they've gotten their foot in the game
yeah,
and they don't want to be taken out of the game because it's been the source of their rising net worth.
yeah.
And this is what I was trying to say in part of the lecture, that in discussing this with your neighbors and friends of why it would be great to move to a system of raising revenue from land only in terms of property, explain to them your house is a depreciating asset. You have to spend money on it every year just for maintenance, and every decade or so, you basically have to replace all the systems. It's a very expensive asset to own, and our societies tax us every year for this depreciating asset, whereas the land is available to us from nature. And so isn't it right that we should compensate society for the privilege of holding on to this little piece of land, but not be penalized for actually owning a house?
No, I agree.
That's my elevator speech, if anyone wanted to listen.
No, I agree. I agree. I agree with the concept. I'm not really a radical, but we've got to bring the fault in a personal way to look at our own effect in the world. I always maintain that when you go into a room to discuss things, you leave all your theories, opinions, and beliefs and prejudices outside, and try and discuss it and discuss the problem anew.
Yeah.
Never happens though.
Well, we all have a conscience. How strong that conscience is, or what our moral sense of right and wrong is, and how that affects what we do and how we live, it's an interesting challenge in modern life.
Yeah, I agree.
Victor, you want to join back in?
Thank you. Basically, oligarchy, if that is acceptable, then you understand at least the framework. The frame of reference is important. Now, I've given 3 sources in the page on the side there. Requiem for the American Dream by Noam Chomsky.
Mm-hmm.
You can watch the whole thing on YouTube. Dan Sheehan, an excellent lawyer, has a whole college course on the essence of the American structure and its problems. And the film, the Canadian film, the documentary, The Corporation, part 1 is free on YouTube. And part 2 has the solutions. And by the way, none of them talk about property tax. On the other hand, they also don't talk about oligarchy. But my point is that unless your frame of reference is clear, then you'll be chasing your tail. And there is a history in this country of opposing oligarchy and aristocracy. And once you get that, then it's a matter of not what you do, but how quickly you can do it. That's all I got.
Now, what you got is a lot there, Victor. And for those of you, who want to pursue this a little bit more, I'll be glad to send you Victor's email address. He sends out a newsletter periodically with some of his insights into what's going on, and it's quite provocative. And Victor and I are both members of Thomas Paine Friends, which is a national organization with members. And one of the things that Victor has trying to promote is for people to create common sense clubs that would be able to pursue some of these issues collectively, as clubs all around the country. It's in some sense, it's equivalent to what members of the Henry George community have done with creating Common Ground USA, and Common Ground USA has chapters around the country that focus mostly on property tax reform, but on tax reform generally. So there's some overlap in what Thomas Paine wrote about. His essay Agrarian Justice is one of the most progressive pieces of writing that was done, certainly in his time and even up to now. So there's a lot to investigate. In my work in creating the School of Cooperative Individualism, my three main intellectual mentors were Thomas Paine, Henry George, and Mortimer J. Adler. So there's a lot to learn from these individuals. And as Victor is challenged, how to make these essential reforms happen is the challenge. Reforms do happen. People are working on them now, collectively and individually, all around the world. And I don't know what the deciding steps will be. I'm reminded of the British historian, what's his name? Burke. Not Edmund Burke. No. This is the modern historian who created this series Connections that was on PBS, and The Day the Universe Changed. And he talked about something, he referred to it as the trigger effect. And that is this snowball effect of ideas that result in changes that no one could really foresee when those initial activities occurred. But we have just about 10 minutes left, and quite a few of you have not said anything. And someone who hasn't spoken, would you please join us and give us your reactions to what you've experienced in this series of lectures and even in our discussions tonight? I don't want to call on anyone because I don't want to force anyone to participate, but it'd be nice to hear from a couple people who have not voiced their thoughts so far in this. Richard, I see you. Okay. I know you've posted a few things in the chat. I haven't had an opportunity to follow it, but
well, let's talk about corporations got me going here. So, but yeah, I wonder if you could talk about what I know Henry George explained the concept of interest, and not with corporations in mind. But do you think that concept has been confused?
Of course it has.
By corporate operations.
It's been confused, by our everyday perception of what interest is. We all think of interest as something we earn when we deposit money in a bank or a financial institution, and it's something we pay when we have a debt obligation to someone. Yeah. So Henry George's description or definition of what interest was limited to the classical political economy, and what he tried to do was to make his definition clear so people understood that when he referred to when he used the term interest, he was referring to that portion of wealth that was produced because of the use of capital goods.
Right.
And and he built his analysis, upon the laws of wealth production and distribution. And I think what he admitted also, but he didn't emphasize this, he called these the laws. They were laws of tendency. And so he admitted that there would be externalities that would affect how wealth was produced and how it ended up being distributed. And government, the question is whether government is endogenous or not, if it's an externality to that fundamental closed system that George described.
So do you think he would regard corporate profits and dividends as unearned?
No, not necessarily.
No,
I think he would look very closely at what portion of those profits came from the production of goods and services and what came from monopoly privileges.
Yeah.
And he would make the distinction that some was earned and some was unearned. But
One of the good features of a corporation is that it forces because the corporation is a separate legal person, it forces the accountant to pay everybody what they're worth. And I think that interest is being paid to the upper level managers and the guys who are using the tools and the capital and all that. So that's my theory anyway, is that.
well, and yeah, this is a little bit late in this series of lectures to go into that sort of discussion, but everyone who shows up and produces something either physically or intellectually is earning wages.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you're talking about corporate executives, the question is, is their compensation fully earned, or are they acquiring some portion of their compensation based on legal privileges, enjoyed under the corporate laws that govern, that society, and because of other monopoly privileges that they might enjoy.
Yeah, I guess only the IRS would really know if the wage was reasonable or.
Well, yeah, just take the one statistic. The multiples of CEO compensation to the average of all employees in that corporate entity.
Yeah, that's.
And it has increased by 1,000 times in the last 25 or 30 years.
Right.
And it's one is hard pressed to justify that in terms of the compensation for the efficiency of labor due to the increase in productivity in terms of the output per unit of input. It would seem that most of the workers that work for a corporate entity have been given a raw deal.
Thank you.
Joe, I'll give you got the last minute or so because everyone
And
else seems to be quiet.
I'd like to make an announcement if you wouldn't mind after Joe, okay?
Yes, of course.
I'd just like to apologize to Charlie. What he told us later about his business being a casualty of COVID, a little insensitive of me. And, in Canada, we had a lot of supports for businesses and the number of casualties actually went down, but there were definitely some, and obviously in Australia as well. And I know anybody who goes through that personally, really traumatic. And I'd just like to apologize, Charlie.
Well, I'm sure Charlie accepts your apology. What many of us went through during COVID-19 was an extraordinary, psychological, challenge to us. I mean, our ability to go places, to get together with friends and relatives, to share experiences. My own personal reaction was that to the best that the scientific community says these vaccines are necessary and appropriate. Many people believe that they were not. And the evidence will probably be fully known only sometime in the future to the extent of what was important and what was less important. And there's not just conspiracy theories, as we all hear, but just the disagreement over what is sound science. And I think all of us have a certain level of risk that we're willing to undertake. And some of us took no risk, and some of us were willing to take a lot of other risk. But I think my view is it points back to this distinction between freedom and liberty. And if I exercise what I think is my freedom, and that violates the liberty of others, and that is the liberty to be free of infection and disease, then I've created an injustice. But none of that seems to be yet very clear, although I have to say that the number of deaths from COVID-19 certainly declined pretty significantly once the vaccines were made readily available. But there are other issues like, should the pharmaceuticals have been as extremely profitable as they became as a result of that, public health emergency. So with that, I won't entertain any discussion, but I will let Ibrahima introduce you to what he has to tell you.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you everyone for your patience. I know it's already 8 o'clock. Just wanted to announce Marty Rowland's upcoming new course. That would be part 2 of his reality economics. I just made a short video just to let you know in advance that the dates will change. We'll move in 1 week, but here it is.
I'd like to thank you for tuning in. My name is Marty Rowland. I teach a course called Reality Economics. And in part 1, we covered the 4 types of firms from perfect competition, competitive monopoly, oligopoly, and monopoly. So in part 2, what we're going to cover, we're going to get a little deeper into the subject of economics, and we're going to cover the law of rent. We're going to talk about capital, talk about wages, money, price, and credit, and value and price. So what we're going to require is that you read the chapters from the assigned books, and we'll have some discussion, and we'll be expecting you to participate. And I really hope that you can join us. Thanks, Ibrahima. Notice that the date, it needed to change. It's November
Well, yes,
2nd.
that's exactly what I said at the beginning. The content is what matters. We're going to push it 1 week ahead.
Yeah.
It's going to start on November 2nd and end early December. Thank you. Good night to you all. Good night, Ed, for a wonderful class, and the discussion was really enlightening. So we look forward to seeing you again soon at the Henry George School.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Good job.
And before you go, I'm going to be in Philly tomorrow. I'm going to send you an email in about 20 minutes. Maybe we could meet.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you.